Have you ever needed a way to schedule all of your automation in an order you choose? Mitch Spano will show us a way to make this happen with his new Apex Trigger framework. Welcome to 100 Days of Trailhead, where the tech community comes to learn Salesforce, learn tech, get inspired, and invest in ourselves. We are your trail guides, here to support you on your learning journey. We release videos weekly. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a video. In the description below, you can find links for everything we mention in this video, as well as books and resources we found useful. Visit our blog, 100daysoftrailhead.com, for other helpful Salesforce and tech content. Ensuring your build follows the order of operations so that your record values, calculations, and solutions have expected results can be challenging. Mitch Spano is introducing us to a new Apex Trigger framework that allows you to organize all of your automation. Mitch is the leader of the Twin Cities, Minnesota developer group. He is currently an application engineer at Google and has 8 years of experience delivering solutions on Salesforce.com. His experience includes application development, architectural design, test planning and execution, and DevOps automation. He currently holds 16 active Salesforce certifications, including Application and System Architect. He also has earned a Master of Science in Software Engineering from the University of Minnesota and is an active member of the Minnesota Software Engineering community. We have the wonderful Mitch.
We are so excited.
Spano. I'm super excited about this because he is going to talk about an Apex framework that he came up with that orchestrates all of your Salesforce automation, and he really has broken the mold with this one. So I got a little preview. I'm not going to lie. So Mitch, he's a leader of the Twin Cities, Minnesota developer user group. He's an application engineer at Google. He has 8 years of experience delivering solutions on Salesforce. He has all of these types of experience here that you see listed. He's got 16 certifications, including application and system architect. He's got a master's of science in software engineering from the University of Minnesota. And then he is also actively involved in many Minnesota software engineering groups. And I've seen him around other places too. So without further ado, the wonderful and incomparable Mitch.
All right, you guys win. That's hands down the best introduction I've ever had for anything in my whole life. I don't even think that my introduction, maybe my future wedding, will be that good. Thank you guys. That was great. Awesome. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's share this desktop. All right, and let me know when you can see.
Yes, we can see.
All right, awesome, cool. So welcome. Thank you for attending today's session. The topic that we're going to be the presentation that we're going to be going over today is called Orchestrate All of Your Salesforce Automation with the Trigger Actions Framework. And when we mean all, we really do mean all. So I got a lot of really cool stuff to show you today. Let's go on to the next thing. The old standard classic, in case anybody happens to be here and they're looking to purchase licenses, if I talk about anything that's not yet available on the Salesforce platform, make sure you purchase licenses based on what's currently available. Yeah, good call, Rachel, too. If you have questions throughout any of this presentation, post them in the chat and we'll have a couple opportunities to interject and get your questions answered. Cool. So I'm the only speaker here today. My name is Mitch Spano. I'm an application engineer at Google, and I work with Rachel every day on the same project. So she asked me to come and give a presentation about this particular topic to this group, and I was very excited, and more so just really grateful for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. So who is the audience, right? So this audience could be anyone, right? A lot of folks here, Apex Trigger framework, maybe this is strictly for developers. If you're in the Salesforce ecosystem at all, there's something that you can take from this discussion. So if you're an architect, I really want you to think about how could implementing something like this help you to scale your organization's implementation of Salesforce, at enterprise and beyond the scale that we've been accustomed to, or we've been used to on the Salesforce platform. There's also some cool strategies in here for you to divide the functionality and partition your application. So keep your ears peeled for those. If you are a developer, I want you to start thinking about how could implementation of a framework like this speed up your delivery of code. And check out check out some of the testing techniques. We'll go over those. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. You might find something useful. But if you're a manager, or maybe you're a senior level administrator, you know, this talk might give you a little bit of better understanding about the problems with legacy trigger frameworks. So you'll have a better understanding of what it means when folks say we need to implement this triggered logic, right? And then also think about, if you manage multiple teams, how could implementing something like this help you to make sure that those teams don't step on each other's toes? So Apex triggers, right? A little bit of background about Salesforce Apex triggers. On the Salesforce platform, we all know that there are multiple tools that we have at our fingertips to do record-based process automation, right? You could write workflow rules to update field values or send email alerts. You could use Process Builder to do kind of more advanced workflow tasks and kick off things like flows, for example. There's been a lot of investment recently in flows, and I think that flows are really becoming more powerful. But really, when it comes to it, triggers are the most powerful thing on the Salesforce platform that we as administrators and developers have at our fingertips to deliver record-based automation. But you know, as you can see, workflows are pretty easy to implement and to maintain, and triggers are much more powerful, but there's also the accompanied risk that comes with that power. So if you implement new triggered logic, then you're going to need a developer to maintain it, and it can decrease the value proposition of utilizing the Salesforce platform, because you could potentially leave all of those administrative skill sets on the sidelines. Writing triggers can get complex too, right? So, you know, you have your trigger context, which is, for example, let's just say we're in after insert context. Then you can check what are the field values and which fields have changed. So if the record type is wholesale, for example, then you can take some actions on the records in the transaction that meet whatever criteria is necessary. So if we inserted and the record type is wholesale, then we need to update the parent account, or we need to send a notification to somebody. But managing all of this stuff inside of the body of one trigger can get really complex, especially if you're in a mature or advanced sales or service cloud implementation where your opportunity trigger or your case trigger is responsible for a whole lot of logic. So when we talk about existing frameworks, right? The existing frameworks have done a really great job of making it so that you have one trigger per object, and you can control the order of execution, and you don't write your logic in the trigger, you write it in the trigger handler itself. And most of them operate in a similar fashion to this, where they give you a method called, say, before update, for example, or after update, or before insert, whatever context it is. And then you perform all of your logic within that particular method. So a lot of times what you'll do is you will do something like this, right? So you'll implement, let's just say after insert, we have to handle the wholesale insert of opportunities and then the retail insert of opportunities. So if you come into an org and your after insert method looks like this, with all these one-liner method calls that just call these private methods elsewhere in the trigger handler, that is really a well-architected, well-designed trigger. It's super easy to read. You understand the order of execution. And it definitely adheres to the pattern, right? You can tell that somebody put a lot of time into making sure that this is easy to read and easy to maintain. But the problem with all of the existing trigger frameworks is that no matter what, you always need to come back in and modify this class. So even if it's written as well as it possibly can be, you're going to add more stuff. You're going to add more stuff to this after insert method. And you're only supposed to have one trigger handler per S object, right? So that means, let's just say you have multiple teams. All teams are responsible for this one class that is the opportunity trigger handler. So the maintenance of this gets kind of unmaintainable as time goes on and as your org has more and more automation that's built into it. So this is kind of the main motivation for what I set out to solve when I started writing the Apex Trigger Action Framework. And there are a couple of other things too that are a little bit less than ideal when it comes to writing triggers in the existing frameworks. So for example, if I wanted to test the logic of the handle wholesale insert method, for example, I would actually need to, in my test, insert an opportunity. And when I insert an opportunity, not only am I testing the logic of the handle wholesale insert method, I'm also testing that that opportunity, adheres and can pass all validation rules. All process builders will execute, workflow rules will execute, flows will execute. So you're not really testing the isolated functionality which you set out to test in your unit test. You're more so performing an integration test where you're seeing how does the system happen as a whole when an opportunity is inserted. So I want to introduce you to what I'm calling the trigger actions framework. Historically, there have been trigger frameworks that will allow you to do those things we just talked about, where you have, say, the after insert method and then you fill it in. But take a look at this. This is this is a little QR code, which has a link to the repository. There's the direct link down below. You could screenshot this if you'd like. Otherwise, I will put it up in the chat later on in the presentation. But the idea behind the trigger actions framework is that no longer do we just rely on classes. All right, I'm going to show you the architecture diagram for the moving parts of the trigger actions framework. We have three main classes. We have the trigger base, we have the metadata trigger handler, and then we have the trigger action itself. Now, I don't want you to worry about this at all, right? The whole point of the Apex trigger action framework is that this stuff exists. So you have these particular classes, and then these two types of metadata. You've got the S-object trigger setting, and then the trigger action metadata itself. You don't ever have to worry about modifying any of this. All that you do when you need to implement new functionality is you just write a class that implements the correct interface. And then you can use custom metadata to determine how and in which order, in which context and in which order does that action execute. So you don't need to touch any of this stuff. You just write your own little classes that are completely separate from the framework. So with that said, I'm going to get out of this presentation. I'm going to go into Salesforce right here. Actually, first thing first, I'll share this link. We got the README for the project up in this particular tab. There's a lot of great content in here, and everything that we're going to be going over today will be present in the README. So just make sure that you take a look if you have questions. And if you have additional questions, you can always reach out directly to me on Twitter. Is probably the easiest way to get a hold of me, just at Mitch Spano. I'll put that in the chat as well. All right. But so we've taken this particular, we've downloaded this project from the repository. We've created a Scratch org. We pushed the stuff to the Scratch org. And then I wrote a couple of additional things. I wrote this one class called TA opportunity stage insert rules, and then this trigger. So when you first start with the framework, you have to write this one-liner trigger, new metadata trigger handler dot run. Okay. And I'm going to show this TA opportunity stage insert rules is the first example of a trigger action which we will implement on the platform. So like I said in the architecture diagram, all you need to do is write an individual class which implements the correct interface, and then we'll use custom metadata to actually make this happen. So this class is pretty small. It's got a very limited scope. Before insert of opportunities, for every opportunity, if the stage name is not prospecting, we're going to add an error that says the stage must be prospecting when an opportunity is created. Pretty limited in scope, all right? But I'm going to go back into Salesforce. So we've installed the trigger actions framework from the repository, and we wrote that one-liner trigger and then that individual class. So I'm here in Salesforce, I'm in the Scratch org, I'm in the setup menu, and I'm going to go to custom metadata types. Custom metadata types. Now, in order to enable the trigger actions framework on an object, you need to write the trigger on the object, and you need to create what I call the S-object trigger setting. So this is just like the name of the S-object that you want to enable the trigger actions on. So I'm going to say new, this is for opportunity enter in the object API name. This can be a standard object, a custom object, or if you are operating on an object from an installed package, then you can also enter in the object namespace. So you can use this on installed packages as well. So I'm gonna press save. Now the trigger actions framework is truly enabled on the opportunity S object. And you'll see when we take a look at this S object trigger settings, you'll see that we'll have all of these related lists for us. There's no related records quite yet, but these are related metadata records. These are not like S object records. So we'll take a look at what that means in just a moment here. But so we've written the trigger, we created the S object trigger setting, and now we need to create a piece of metadata that says, hey, I want to execute that Apex that I wrote on the opportunity S object. So I'll go back to custom metadata types, go to trigger action, right? And I'll manage the trigger actions. I'll create a new one. And what you do is you need to take the name of the class that you wrote. So in this case, it's TA underscore opportunity underscore stage insert rules. And I'm going to create a custom metadata record where I populate that in the Apex class name. Then I specify, all right, what is the order in which I want this to execute? This is going to be the first thing that executes before insert. This is a metadata lookup on the opportunity S object, right? So if I try to save this, I'll get an error. There's this description box and it says you must enter a description for this trigger action. So no longer can your developers just write a bunch of code and not tell other people what it does. So this prevents an opportunity from being inserted when the stage name is not prospecting. All right, we'll save this. Okay, cool. So we wrote our little snippet of code that is the trigger action itself. We wrote the trigger, we set up the custom metadata. I'm gonna go check out some opportunities. I've got nothing that's recently viewed. Let's try to create a new opportunity. My op, right? Let's say that it closes today and we'll try to insert it as closed one. The stage name must be prospecting when an opportunity is created. Kind of looks like a validation rule. I promise you it's not. This was implemented because we wrote this tiny little particular action. And then we said this action is the first thing that'll execute on an opportunity. So for example, if I go, let me see here. So if I go back into the object manager, no, in that case, opportunity, we'll see validation rules. We have none. That was actually implemented via the trigger action itself. So the idea here is like, okay, cool. We wrote a little trigger action. That's great. But the advantage now is that I don't need to take that trigger action and plug it back into the opportunity trigger handler. If I need to write a new trigger action, I just write a new trigger action. So let's go back into Visual Studio Code. Let's create a new class, right? And I'll call it TA opportunity. And we'll call it name hello. Okay, now I'm going to copy this so I don't need to rewrite as much. So this is the class is called name hello. Right? Before insert, what we're going to do is for every opportunity, we're just going to say op.name equals hello. So now we've got these two separate classes. Each one of them does an individual action, right? So we've written the class. I'm going to push it back up to Salesforce. And then we'll go back into the setup menu and say, this is the order in which these actions are supposed to happen. So the deployment should be good. Looks like it's good. We'll go back to Salesforce. We'll go to manage records for trigger actions. I'll create a new one. And this one's called TA opportunity name hello. That's the name of the Apex class. Let's say that's the second thing that happens before insert on opportunity. Sets the name to hello. All right, so now we've written another class. We just modified this particular piece of metadata. Now we can take a look at the opportunity S-object trigger setting, and we'll see this nice related list ordered view of all of the actions that happen on the opportunity S-object. So first, we're prevented from inserting opportunities if their stage name is not prospecting. Then we'll give those opportunities a default name of hello. So if I go back to new opportunity, let's try to insert this again. Stage must be prospecting. Okay, that's great. If I insert it with I change the stage name to prospecting, I'll insert it. I've got this name of my op, but I press save, should hit the database, run through the trigger framework, and it's got this default name of hello. So no longer is the management or the maintenance of the opportunity trigger handler burdensome to the developers. Your developer doesn't need to be responsible for all of the other thousands of lines of code in the opportunity trigger handler. Instead, they can just write an individual action that does exactly what they need it to do. And then you can use custom metadata to say, this action happens after this action or before this one, and you can determine the order in which they execute. I'm going to pause there. I don't see any questions in the chat. Just curious if you guys happen to have any questions about the moving parts of the framework, you know, the metadata itself, the trigger handler, how we write the individual actions.
We just have, this is superb.
Thank you. Thank you. I cannot explain how excited I am to share this. So
I got a quick question about order.
Yep.
So obviously you went with doing order 1, order 2. Is there an issue with skipping numbers, or what happens if you accidentally, you know, make both things order 1? How does it decide what order to fire them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it'll by default, so order is required. And by default, if the order is not, if you have two that have the same order, I believe that the name will be the next thing that will delineate the order. But you'll see, if you take a look in the custom metadata, you'll see I added some decimal places to the order itself. Because you're right, if I had 10 actions and I needed to insert a new action and it was the 5th thing, I need to shift everything else down. So there's a little bit of flexibility here with the order. And there's also a dual purpose of the order having decimal places instead of just an integer value. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. But yeah, that's a little bit of a safety measure to prevent from that massive update of all of those integer order values. So one thing that's really cool about the Apex Trigger Actions framework, and you'll see all of the stuff that we're going to go over today is present in the README. So I'll zoom in a little bit, right? So when you use the framework, you create a one-liner trigger on whatever object you want. Here's our stage insert rules, right? If the stage name is not equal prospecting, then add the error. So you'll see a lot of this stuff should be familiar in terms of examples. Now, there are a few cool things that you get for free besides just like, you know, partitioning the logic into these tiny little classes is a big win. This is something we've never been able to do in the Salesforce world. But there are also some other cool things that I want to show you about the Trigger Actions framework itself. So if you take a look, for example, sets name to hello, let's take a look at this record. It has this checkbox for bypass execution. So there's a checkbox like this on the action record itself. And there's also a checkbox like this on the object record itself. So if I go into this name hello, right, and I'm say bypass execution, and I'm going to press save. Let's go back and create a new opportunity. My op, right? say close today. Let's say that I try to do it in perception analysis. I'm going to press save. Stage name must be prospecting. So the stage name must be prospecting one is still active. But if we do put the stage name to prospecting and I insert it, you'll see the default setting of the name to hello is no longer active because we bypass the execution on that individual action. So you can do that at the individual action level on the action records with the bypass itself, right? Or you can do that at the S-object level. You can just turn off all actions, which is basically like deactivating the trigger. So those are two pretty neat bypass mechanisms that we have. But sometimes it's not exactly how you want the bypass to work. So these kind of checkboxes, they will stay active until you turn them back on, right? So these bypasses will stay active until this checkbox is unchecked. So that's good for like some initial data loads, or some off-hour data loads would definitely be helpful, or if you have deprecated an object, or if you're in pre-production. These are all helpful uses of the bypass execution checkbox. But we also have a couple of other different mechanisms by which we can bypass. So I'm going to open up Developer Console, right? And let's open up an Execute Anonymous window, and let's create an opportunity. Whoops. All right, let's give it a name. All right, let's give it a stage name, or let's give it a close date. Now let's also zoom in a little bit. Let's make it a little easier to read. So close date equals date.today. All right, and let's give it a stage. We'll just say qualification for right now. Okay. Now what we're going to do is insert the opportunity. Okay, I'm going to go back and I'm just going to make sure that this one is activated again. So now all of our trigger actions should be active, right? If I go in here, let's create one through the user interface just to make sure that everything is still working. Let's not go prospecting. Let's go qualification. Stage name must be prospecting. That one's still working. If the stage name is prospecting, we insert it, sets a hello. Okay, those actions are still active, right? They're still working because the bypass execution is not checked. But if we go back into Developer Console, right? So let's just say I try to do this. This should fail, right? Because we're inserting in the opportunities stage is qualification. So, okay, stage must be prospecting when an opportunity is created. Okay, that's exactly what we expected. Now, check this out. I can bypass an individual action for the rest of an Apex transaction. So if you have a certain thing that happens once in a while, let's just say you have a data admin user that once a month runs a cleanup script, and you want to bypass some validation rule as that, or some triggered action as that cleanup script runs. So let's just say you have a trigger action that prevents the name from being, prevents opportunities from being inserted when their stage name is not prospecting. We can bypass that just for this Apex transaction. So what we do is we say metadata trigger handler dot bypass the action name that we want. And this is the class, this is the name of the class. So we want to bypass the insert rules. Now this is a static bypass, right? So this will only stay active for one transaction. We're able to insert the opportunity even though the stage name was qualification. So let's take a look now here. So if we said, let's see what this opportunity looks like after we insert it. Okay, so this, well, let's also get the stage name. Okay, let's execute this. We'll take a look at the log. We should see that we inserted it and the name gets set to hello, but the stage is qualification. Okay, so we bypass the check for that individual action. You also can bypass all of the stuff on the S object itself for the remainder of the transaction by saying trigger base dot bypass, and you pass in the S object name. So in this case, it would be opportunity. All right. So now we should be able to insert this, and we'll be able to do it with the stage name of qualification with no issues, and we should retain our original name and not get that default name of hello. So name is my opportunity, stage name is qualification. So you have a couple of different bypass mechanisms, right? You can bypass from the custom metadata itself. Can a bypass be removed during a transaction? Yes, that's a great question. So you can then say trigger base dot clear bypass on opportunity. Or you could say trigger base clear all bypasses if you want to. So you can clear those static bypasses whenever you need to. Same thing for metadata trigger handler. So there's clear all bypasses or clear an individual bypass at the metadata trigger handler itself. So you can pick and choose. So if you take a look in the documentation, we'll go to bypass. Where is it? It's down here a little bit. Bypass mechanisms. So these static bypasses, right? You can bypass and then clear at the end. So there is a third type of bypass as well. Let's just say that you have like a data integration user, for example, and this data integration user should be able to bypass an individual action or maybe all automation on a given S object. If you take a look at both the S object trigger setting and the trigger action themselves, they have these two different fields, required permission and bypass permission. So bypass permission, enter in the API name of a permission, and then if the running user has that permission, then this action or this object will be completely bypassed for that user. So you can create like a bypass opportunity trigger custom permission, assign it to your data integration user, and then they'll just be able to do whatever they want and they won't run any triggers. There's also another one called required permission. So this is kind of the opposite, right? So if somebody has if the required permission is populated, the object or the action will only execute if the running user has that particular permission. So that's super nice for if you're beta testing new features and you have like a subset of users that are your beta test users. You can just create a custom permission and assign that custom permission to those users via permission set group, or excuse me, via permission group, via permission set, and assign it to those individual users for your beta test. And then when the beta test, when that triggered functionality is supposed to go live, you just remove the required permission on the S object trigger setting or on the individual action itself. So I'm not going to demonstrate that, but I just wanted to call it out that we have another bypass mechanism. So just to recap, we can bypass with the checkbox. The checkbox will stay bypassed until it turns back on, until you uncheck it, basically. You can bypass from Apex, right? And these are static bypasses. They will stay active until you either clear them or until the transaction completes. You can bypass at again, all of this stuff is applicable at the object level or the individual action level as well. So this is like this unified bypass mechanism interface, multiple bypass mechanisms interfaces are definitely a big value add for the trigger action framework. So you can get real flexible with how you introduce new automation into your Salesforce org with this. There is one other thing I want to talk about when it comes to Apex with the trigger actions framework, And I'm going to just go over to the README. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom. If you take a look at how we write these, for example, we're passing in this list of opportunity called new list to the before insert method. Now before insert, it's not that applicable, but a lot of times we have stuff that happens on update where we need to check, did a field value change? And if so, then we need to take some action. But keep in mind, we're passing in the new list and the old list to these method calls. So one thing that you can do when you write triggered actions is you can actually test the logic of your trigger action without actually having to insert the record at all. So included in the trigger actions framework, there's a small class called test utility. And the test utility has a method called getFakeID. This fake ID method will return to you a syntactically correct record ID for a given SObject type. So you could pass it in, you could pass in like SObject.account, and it would give you a fake account ID, but it's syntactically correct. It's got the right object prefix. You won't get a compiler error should you assign it as an account ID. You won't get an invalid ID error, things like that. But take a look at what we do here. We can use that fake ID to then fake out the method call and say, this is the new version of the record. This is the old version of the record. Run your logic without ever having to insert or update the record in the first place, right? So for example, on this particular test, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more. So we've got our new list. We've got our old list. We generate a fake record ID. We say the old version of this opportunity was qualification and the new version is closed won. So they skipped all of the stages. They went just straight from qualification to closed won. What we'll do then is we'll create a new, we'll instantiate our new trigger action and then call the method itself in our test. But we've never inserted an opportunity, and we don't need to update that inserted opportunity from qualification to closed won in order to test the logic. This test, now we can make our assertions without ever having to insert the record itself. So we're going to assert that the element in new list at position 0 has errors. It's got exactly one error. The error message is the invalid stage change error from qualification to closed won. So with the trigger actions framework, you really don't need to insert your records during most cases. I see a question, Emily, will the test ID method work with custom objects and objects that depend on each other objects? That's a good point. So if you have child-related objects, this isn't a silver bullet for that. There are other ways to help you navigate that, but in certain cases, you're not going to be able to test your logic. You're going to have to actually insert the records, especially for like, I don't know, say opportunity line item. You need a parent opportunity ID, right? And you probably need to have all of that stuff inserted. So this isn't a silver bullet, but implementing something like this can really speed up your test execution time, like orders of magnitude faster. So on deploy days, when you have to sit there and you wait for that little green circle to make it all the way around, that time that you wait could be a fraction of the time that you're waiting currently today. So this is just a tool. It's not, like I said, it's not a silver bullet. It won't work for everything, but it can help you to properly isolate the scope of what you're testing to just be your triggered action itself. You can cover all the logic, make sure all your logic looks good. And then your tests are a little bit more repeatable that way as well. Tests get a little bit more repeatable as you remove scope of things that can break. So this is a very nice perk of the trigger actions framework. Next thing I want to talk about is how can the trigger actions framework help you to work together in teams, right? So the first thing, one of the first things we talked about was the fact that the opportunity trigger handler in historic or legacy trigger handlers, it needs to be owned or maintained by all team members, right? If you have multiple different teams, in order to maintain that single injection point of your code, everybody needs to own the opportunity trigger handler. This partitioning mechanism, now that we can split out our logic, you can really say, hey, for example, let's just say we had a retail team and a wholesale team. Hey, retail, you operate in this way. Hey, wholesale, you operate in this way. And I'll give you a couple of strategies about how we can do that. The first one is to take a look at the SFDX project JSON directory itself. So SFDX project.json says which package directories in my project are applicable to contain things which will get deployed to Salesforce. So these are things like for example, right now, everybody just typically operates in Force app, but you could split out Force app to say, hey, this is my base application. This is like, trigger frameworks, HTTP callout libraries, standard objects, the home page, things like that that's shared. Then you could have shared opportunity automation that's for all opportunities in the system. And then you could also have a folder that's just for your retail folks. The retail folks only care about modifying the contents of the retail folder, and the wholesale folks have their own folder as well. So you can then put the individual Apex classes into those folders or those packages within your directory structure. And the wholesale team will never step on the toes of the retail team. Then another thing we were talking about earlier is the order, right? So if you want to, this is another tool in the toolbox, right? It might be helpful to execute all stuff for the retail team together and then execute the wholesale team stuff. So if you want to do that, you can use the order where the thing to the left of the decimal is the team prefix, and everything to the right of the decimal is the actual order itself. So 2 could be the team prefix for retail, 3 could be the team prefix for wholesale. And then they can just operate within, they have 1,000 trigger actions that they could potentially author in this context. So, you could use the decimal or the integer part of the order itself as a prefix for your team to help partition that logic. So, but here's a good example of it, right? So we've got some things that are sharing prefix 1, but then the wholesale defaults is prefix 2, the retail defaults is prefix 3. So with that, that's my presentation about the trigger actions framework. Super excited to share this with the world. There's a lot of cool stuff in here. I think that bridging that gap between your developers and your administrators is really going to be great. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this can be used within the Salesforce ecosystem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Woo!
This was fabulous.
Yes.
Does anybody have any last minute questions? Yeah, we've got, this is amazing. How do you
recommend bundling queries for the number of trigger actions? That's a great question. Let's take a look at the README. If you want to, there's a section called, one thing I didn't talk about, recursion prevention. The trigger base itself has, Trigger base itself has this ID to number of times seen after update or before update. So you can use that to say, this is the first time I've seen this record, and you can choose to recursively modify that or not if you want to. There's some information about bypass mechanisms, right? So you can clear all the bypasses, avoid repeated queries. So if you write you can write an individual action which is responsible for executing all of your queries. And I've got an example of it right here. It uses the singleton pattern to have one object that executes the queries and stores the results. And then you can say that is the first particular thing that we want to happen. The first thing that we do is we execute the queries. And then you can use the results of those queries in any subsequent triggered action. So for example, TA opportunity queries .get instance .before account map, right? So if, for example, on opportunity, a lot of times you need to query for the parent account. So right here, we're creating an ID of account ID to account itself. And then for all opportunities, we're populating that map for them. So you don't need to re-query the account S object multiple times. Anybody want to take a look under the hood? See how this is all stitched together?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So like I said at the very beginning of the presentation, there are a few core classes. The easiest one to describe is the trigger action class itself, right? So trigger action just contains, it is a class that just has inner classes that are the interfaces that we need. So before insert, after insert, before update, however we want. Then there's the trigger base. The trigger base is responsible for checking the current context and calling the current context specific method, right? So for example, we'll say if we are before insert, we're going to try to do the before insert thing. If we have an exception, we're going to add that exception to all the records in the transaction. If we're after insert, we're going to try to do the after insert thing. If we have an exception, we'll add that message, add that error to all records in the transaction. If we are before update, we're going to populate that ID to number of times seen before update. So this is like an occurrence map. It's how many times have we seen this record? So you can use this to make sure that you're not recursively modifying the same exact record. And then we call the before update method itself. So the trigger base does all of that kind of normal, if is before, trigger dot is before and trigger dot is update, then before update. It does all of that, and it also populates these maps for you, and it also handles any unhandled exceptions. It also, has those methods for interacting with the bypass, clear bypass, so on and so forth. It also will just make sure that it's executing correctly, right? That you're calling it from a trigger itself and that it's not bypassed. It'll also retrieve the S object name from the new list and the old list. And then you'll have it'll specify what context are you in, and then what is trigger new and trigger old. That's kind of the scope of the trigger base. But the metadata trigger handler is really where the magic happens, right? So metadata trigger handler, the way that this works is it extends the trigger base. So it does all of the stuff that the trigger base does. It checks like is before insert, then call before insert, is after update, then call after update. It does all that stuff. But what we're doing is we're saying, this is what it means to do before insert. We're going to execute the before insert actions. Before insert actions, we get those by querying our trigger action metadata type. So we get what's the class name, what's the order, what's the flow name, what are the bypassed permissions or required permissions that we need for all of the stuff that's configured for this S object that is not bypassed, and we're going to order by the order. So we make a metadata, we query the metadata itself, and then what we try to do is for every context, what we try to do is we basically cast all of the trigger action metadata that was returned to us from the query into instances of the object that's defined at the Apex class name level. So what does that mean? If we go into custom metadata types, we'll go back to opportunity, right? The stage insert rules. So we're taking the string of TA opportunity stage insert rules, and we're creating a new instance of the TA opportunity insert rules class itself. And we also then handle the specific case of if it's the trigger action flow, okay? So we query, we dynamically cast these to the right type, right? We make sure that it's not bypassed. And if, depending on what the context is, we call that, we cast it to an instance of the interface and then call that interface's public method. So we query the metadata, in order, we cast it, we create an object of the correct instance, and we cast it to the particular interface, to an object that is an instance of the particular interface that matches the context that we're in, and then calls the method that's defined. So that's how we do it. That's how we basically translate your custom metadata into real actions at runtime using the metadata trigger handler. And then the trigger action flow itself. Trigger action flow, if you take a look, trigger action flow is just a trigger action, right? It implements all of the trigger action interfaces. So that's kind of cool. You can do flows that are after undelete, which is not possible in the core platform, Salesforce platform right now. So what we do is basically, here's the get old record. What we do is we traverse we have the current record that we're looking for, and then we have the old list. We just basically find the current record in the old list and return it. So there's no queries, there's no anything that needs to be worried about. It's totally safe to do in a for loop. But you'll see that these context specific methods, what we're doing is we're dynamically instantiating a flow. And then if we're before insert or before update, we're applying those values from the new list after flow back to the new list. So we're dynamically instantiating a flow and we're starting it before update or before insert, we apply the flow values. Before update, we also check to say, do you want to allow flow recursion? Because if you take a look here, if we are a flow, there's this allow flow recursion checkbox. If this is unchecked, by default, the flow will only process a record one time. If you check this, then the flow can process the record multiple times. It's a little bit advanced, but it's given for parity with what's available to us via Process Builder and Flow right now. So if we're before update, we need to determine if we're going to execute based on if we have not yet processed the record, or if we have, we create the flow by its name, and then we start the flow, and then we apply the flow values after the flow. Same thing for after update, right? ID to number of times seen after update equals 1. It's the first time we've seen this record, or allow recursion. We don't care how many times we've seen this record, then we're going to process that record. So those are the core components of this framework. And the idea is you don't need to touch them at all. You just write your own little individual actions, and then you control the order of the execution of those actions with the custom metadata.
So we've got a question here. What are the performance diffs between Apex and trigger action declaratively used?
Performance diffs for an individual action, right? So if you wrote the same function in Flow versus in Apex, I think that's the question. I'm going to step back just a little bit here. Just performance of the overall framework itself. The way that it works is when you perform a DML operation, let's just say I'm going to insert an account. When we do that, we query one time the things that need to happen before insert on account. And then we do all of those things in order. And that query to do that costs about 7 to 9 milliseconds on average. So that's the runtime overhead that is included with the trigger actions framework. It's actually pretty minimal. But in terms of like an individual action being written as a flow versus as Apex, in theory, Flow is going to be a little bit slower because it needs to be interpreted, whereas Apex can just be executed. But for most of these things, the difference is going to be so computationally negligible that it's not going to make that big of a difference. So.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you for coming. We are so grateful for you. You guys are amazing. We love our WIT Devs community, and we are so grateful for Mitch because,
yes.
I think this is one of the first or second times he's presenting it to the world, and it's for us, it's oh, this is so cool. Anyway,
thank you so much, Mitch. Thank you, each and every one of you, for being here.
Yes.
And that recording will be up on 100 Days of Trailhead YouTube.
Yes.
Not this upcoming week, but the following.
Yes. So to everybody, happy Saturday. Bye. We'll see you later. See you on the socials. Thank you, Mitch. You rock.
Thank you. Goodbye.
And with that, we're at the end. What scenario are you going to implement this new Apex Trigger framework in? Comment below. We would also love to hear what video topics you want us to cover in future videos in the comments. If you've made it to this point, we want to take an opportunity to say thank you. Since you stayed with us, here's a bonus. Utilizing Lightning flows with this Apex Trigger framework can be a great way to order your execution for your build. Let's watch as Mitch explains.
I created this trigger framework at the end of last year. I was working on it during the summer, and I published this during the fall, and I shared it to some colleagues. And I had an individual who I've worked with on projects in the past. He said, you know, Mitch, this is awesome, but I wonder if you could make this work with flows. So at that time, I hadn't hadn't stitched it together quite yet, but I'm really, really excited to share that the trigger actions framework can also allow you to write flows, and then you can control the order of execution of your flows in relation to your Apex. So you could say Apex action, flow, flow, Apex, flow, however you need to, and control it all from this one user interface. So let's see what it looks like to create a flow and then plug the flow into the trigger actions framework. So I'm going to go to flows. Let's create a new one. Now these flows, you have to write them in a particular way. So there's a little bit of a learning curve because you need to operate on a collection of records instead of an individual run. So these flows, you have to write them in a particular way. All of this is covered in the documentation. You should be able to have some examples to look back on. So for example, right in here, take a look at the support for flows section. It talks about how you need to write them. All of this is documented, okay? But I'm going to go back into Flow Builder. All of the flows, in order to write a flow that can be used with the trigger actions framework, it needs to be an auto-launched flow, right? And then depending on what context you're in and what you want to do, you're going to need to create certain flow variables. So I'm going to go to Element Manager. I'm going to create a new resource, and this new resource is a variable, and I'm going to call it the new list. Now these API names are specific. They're covered in the documentation, but the API names are what allows this to just plug right into the trigger actions framework. And you'll see how all this comes together in just a moment. So new list, right? This is a record variable. It's a collection. The type of object is opportunity, right? And you need to say this one's available for input. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to be operating on the new list, and the new list just basically holds trigger.new records. They're just passed into the flow. The whole contents of trigger.new is what's populated in new list. So what we're going to do is, let's go. The first thing that we're going to do is, this is where it gets different because you're operating on a collection. So you need to start with a loop. So for each record, right? For every record that is in the new list of opportunities, right? Let's assign those records. Let's give them a name, set name to goodbye. Okay, so what we're going to do is the current record's name is going to equal, let's create a new resource that's a constant called goodbye. That is a text and it's got the value goodbye. All right, cool. So for every record, we set the name to goodbye. Now, there is one thing that you need to do. If we want to do this in the before insert or before update context, at the end of your loop, the final stage of your loop must be, you need to assign the current records to a variable called new list after flow. And that means it's the new list after the flow has completed. So we will create a new assignment, add to new list after flow, right? We'll create a new resource. This resource is a variable called new list after flow, right? It is a record collection of opportunities, right? Now this one needs to be marked as available for output, okay? So, and we're going to add the current record to the new list after the flow is completed. There we go. So like I said, that's the final stage in your loop. So this flow, for every record that's in the new list, it sets the name to goodbye and then it adds it to the new list after the flow is completed. Okay, so I press save. We'll call this the goodbye flow. Okay, we'll save it. It's saved, but it's not yet activated. So let's activate it. Okay, cool. This auto launch flow is activated, but it's not getting launched from anywhere. Now this is where the magic happens. Let's go back in. Let's go to custom metadata types. right? Let's create a new trigger action for the case goodbye flow, or excuse me, the opportunities goodbye flow. Now, what you do in order to enable a flow is you paste the API name of the flow into flow name. So that's the third thing. And the Apex class name, if I were to just insert some bogus class name, this is happening on opportunity, set name to goodbye, right? It'll say, the Apex class name must equal trigger action flow if the flow name is populated. So you'll save yourself from making a mistake there. Right? Press save. There we go. So now we take a look at our opportunity. We'll see we do 3 triggered actions. We make sure that the stage name is prospecting. Then we set the name to hello, and then we set the name to goodbye. So the hello should be set, and then it should be overridden by the goodbye. So let's go back into Salesforce. I'm going to go to opportunities. Let's insert a new opportunity. My op closes today. Let's just make sure that that prospecting rule still works. All right, stage must be prospecting. That's great. Okay, let's go to prospecting. It'll get set to hello, and then it'll get overridden by the flow and get set to goodbye. So we can now write individual flows and plug them in whatever order we need to. And we get this universal view on the S-object trigger setting metadata of here are the things that are happening in this order on the S-object itself. So if we were to go in here, let's let's change the order. Let's swap those orders. So save that. And we'll set this one to 2. So now it sets to goodbye first and then hello. Let's create a new opportunity. My op, right? Closes today. Stage is prospecting, and we expect it to have a final value for the name of hello. There we go. So you can write your flows, write your Apex. You no longer need to worry about controlling the order of execution because we control that. The platform does not control that. You don't have to worry, is this flow going to execute before this trigger? Is this trigger going to override this process builder? All of that can be handled just with a combination of little Apex individual actions and flows. And then you can control the order of execution for each one of them. There's another cool thing about flows here too. So we noticed, right, like, okay, this is an auto launch flow. This is kind of simple, right? We're setting the name to goodbye. That's totally fine. But auto launch flows have limitations, right? For example, you can't call is changed or prior value on an auto launch flow. There is some unique workarounds in the trigger actions framework that'll allow you to fetch the old value of the record while you're doing something. So I'm going to go to auto launch flow. Let's create a new one. Okay, now this one's going to happen before update. So what we'll do is before update, if the stage changes, we'll set a default description of the opportunity. Okay, so in order to do that, let's create a new resource. Well, let's create a new resource that is not a constant, it's a variable called new list, right? That it is a record, that is a collection of records of opportunities, right? And that's available for input. Okay, cool. But when we're in an update scenario, we also have the old list, right? So let's create a new resource. It is a variable called old list. That is a record collection of opportunities, right? And then this one is also available for input. So new list and old list, they're available for you. And depending on the context in which you want your flow to execute, you just use them if they're available. So we're going to be doing this before update. So we have both the new list and the old list are available to us. Before insert, the old list doesn't exist. So you can't create that, or you can create it as a resource, but it won't be defaulted with any values for you. So now we create another one that is a variable called the new list after flow. Right. The new list after flow is for assigning values back to the records during before insert and before update context. It's the state of the new list after the flow has completed. So it's a record collection of opportunities, right? That is available for output, because at the end of the flow, we need to take the values that are in here and apply them to the records. So available for output. So these three variables are really what you need in order to write your flows in a way that they can get plugged into the trigger actions framework. So, but what we're worried about are those limitations of auto launch flows. So let's start this again, just like we did last time for each record, right? That is in the new list. We'll start the flow there. Okay, cool. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new resource that is an individual record called the old record, right? So it's a record. It's not a collection, but it's an opportunity. And we just need it for the scope of this flow itself. Okay, so now we've got a variable called old record. We're going to take an action, right? There are plenty of Apex actions included in the trigger actions framework that'll help you to make your flows work really well with all of this. So we'll go to type, we'll go to Apex action, and we'll take a look. We've got some cool things, right? So we've got, I won't worry about most of them. Let's talk about get old record first. So the get old record, you need to specify what are the types that we're looking at. This is going to be the current record is an opportunity. The old list contains opportunities, and the output that we're looking for is an opportunity as well, right? The current record that we're on is the current record in the loop. The old list is just the old list of opportunities. And then we undo this, we check down this little advanced checkbox, and we assign the output of this Apex call to the old record, okay? So now what we're doing is for each record, we get the old version of the record. Now this get old record Apex call, we're not querying. What we're doing is we're just pulling in the old record from what was in trigger.old. So this is totally safe to do in a loop. It's totally fast. You won't be blowing up your query limits. You're totally fine here. Now we're going to make a decision, right? So did the stage change? Whoops. Okay. So if the old record, oh, not get old record, if the old record's stage does not equal the current records, let me see here, the current records stage, then we know that the stage has changed. So if the stage changed, we're going to set a default description. So we're going to say the current records description equals a new, it's going to be a constant, and we'll set it, its data type is text. Women in Tech Devs group is the coolest. All right, there we go. So what do? We have the old record. Did the stage change? If the stage changed, we set the default description. Now the final step of our loop in the before, insert and before update needs to be to add to the new list after flow. Add to new list after flow. So the new list after flow, we're going to add the current thing. So this is, again, the new list after flow is the state of the new list after the flow is completed. And it's used for us to assign record updates or field updates to the record during the before insert and before update context. So it's always got to be the final thing of the loop if you're in before insert and before update and you're modifying field values. So here we go. So if the default description is set, then we're going to add it. We're still going to add it if it's not set. Because again, it's always got to be the final thing in the loop. And then we close our loop. So what are we doing here? What are we doing here? For every item, we get the old version of the record. If the stage changed, then we're going to set the default description. And no matter what, we always add to the new list after the flow is complete. And that is our flow. So I'm going to save this flow and we'll call it description or op description. All right, we'll save it. We'll activate it. Now we'll go back into custom metadata types. We'll create a new trigger action. That's called the op description. The name is trigger action flow for the Apex class. That's going to be the first thing that happens. Here's the name of the flow that we're launching. This is going to be before update on opportunity, right? So that's the default description if the stage changed. All right. Now we've written our flow. We were able to fetch the old prior values from the old list without making any additional queries. We're able to write back before update or before insert context. So let's take a look at one of our opportunities that we've inserted. So if we take a look at the details, right now the description is empty. If I set a type, let's just set a type, right? And we still don't have a description. But if I change the stage, the description is automatically set for us via a flow that we just plugged in with the trigger actions framework. So this can really, really help us to bridge that gap between the programmatic Apex side of the Salesforce platform and the declarative or administrative side with flows of the Salesforce platform. No longer will folks be having this religious debate about which one's better. We all can play along, we all can play together, and we all can maintain that level of control that we so desperately desire and need in order to build Salesforce applications at scale. There's also one thing that's kind of cool about this too, with the flows. So there were a few things that we talked about the get old record Apex action, right? Let's also, let's modify this flow, right? So instead of setting the default description, let's go like this. Between setting the default description and adding back to the new list, let's call another action. This one is something that I think you guys will definitely appreciate. So let's add a new action. It's an Apex action, right? So we can implement bypasses just like we do with the Apex-based bypasses. So you can bypass, right? Your bypass type, you enter in Apex, object, or flow for the bypass type, and then the API name of whatever you're trying to bypass. And this will allow you to, this is basically the same thing as what we did in Developer Console. So if you enter in bypass action with bypass type of object, that's basically calling the trigger-based.bypass method itself. If you enter it in with the bypass type of Apex, it's going to call the metadata trigger handler.bypass. You also from Apex can call trigger action flow .bypass, and you can bypass a flow by its API name as well. And you can do the same thing in the flow itself. So the bypass Apex action, there's also there's bypass, clear all bypasses, clear an individual bypass, or tell me if an individual bypass is active. All of those things that we have on the Apex side, we also have on the flow side. But the one thing that I really want to show you is add error. So this add error action, right? What we can do is we select the record that we want to add an error for. It's a type is opportunity. Now the error message, let's create a new error message. That's a constant called error, right? It's text, and let's give it a value of, oh no, something went wrong blame Mitch. All right. So, and what we can do is the record that we want to add this for is the current record that we're looping over. So after we set the default description, we're just going to add this error and we'll just plug that in right there. So now I'll save this as a new version of the same flow. Deactivate, add an error for each record. Opportunity, done. Let's go like this. There we go. So I think I just had something in the loop that was wrong, but you can use the add error method itself to add a nicely formatted error to a record in a flow itself. Flow errors on the out of the box platform, flow errors are not exactly the best, but you can use the Apex trigger action framework to add errors to records. So very excited to share that.
Thank you for spending time with us. Please like and subscribe to our channel because we share weekly content to support your tech and Salesforce learning journey. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss a new video. We also handpick these videos, which we recommend you watch next. Connect with us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and on 100daysoftrailhead.com, all of which are listed below. Thank you for learning with us, and we'll see you back tomorrow.